Hey there, everybody, and welcome to Beyond the Podcast. I'm really excited today. I have Elizabeth Bachman with me. So we did a podcast I wouldn't say several years ago, but it was more than a year ago. And as everybody knows, with Beyond the Podcast, this is to us for an opportunity for us to find out where are they now, what's happening now in your business. When you reflect back about a year and a half ago, about what you were focused on and what you're focused on now and how things have changed. So, welcome. So happy to see you again, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Jen. It was really fun. As I was saying, I had just re-listened to our conversation and also my conversation with you about building teams on my podcast.
On your
So
podcast, yeah. Yeah.
it
So,
was
what is the
really
name of your podcast again? Let's make sure we
my
get that.
podcast is called Speakers Who Get Results.
Awesome.
And because my thought always is you could go out there and talk about what's interesting to you, what's fun for you. What I like is how can you use that as a tool to get the results that you want? And so that's why I chose that name for my company.
Yeah. And so we were just talking in the green room about how things are changing, for you. And they do for all of us. I mean, we all grow all day long, and that's why we do Beyond the Podcast. So one of the things that's grown for you is that this podcast that you're mentioning is going to be ending. As you said, all shows must end, right? But there's a new show that's in the works. You may not be ready to tell everyone about it, but tell us a little bit about why that transition, and why it's important for people to not have that white knuckle effect on something that maybe isn't serving them any longer.
Well, it was part of my thinking over the last 3-4 months. Speakers Who Get Results. It was a podcast about presentation skills, but my background was 30 years as an international opera director. So I know a lot about the arc of a speech, the arc of a show. What we go from beginning to
hero's
end.
journey. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, the hero's journey, but the hero's journey is the substance. That's part of it. But if you are writing a speech where especially if you're going to ask people to do something, whether it's a presentation within your organization, this is a meeting, or is it on a panel or whatever, how do you move people to take action? That's what I'm all about, is how do you present to get the result you want, which means you start at the end, which means you have to know where the end is. And so that's what happened with the podcast. And I was talking with a wonderful colleague of mine who's going to produce my next podcast, because I really like her material. And she said, well, maybe you've said what you have to say. And I thought, in this format, I think it's time after 5 years for Speakers to Get Results to wind up. So the final episode dropped on New Year's Eve, 2024. I started it in December of 2020, on Christmas Eve, December 2019, Christmas Eve, and ending New Year's Eve, December 2024, 5 years. And the new one is going to be around my program, the Visible and Valued program, where I have a program for women, mostly corporate women, who aren't feeling heard and who recognize that they might be partly in their own way. I mean, that certainly was my problem. The reason why I started all this was I realized that my glass ceilings were as much internal as external. And so now what I do is I try to help women get through glass ceilings. And my motto is getting more women's voices heard in places of power, whether that be a boardroom or whether it's in the leadership of your organization or the leadership in your community. That's what it's about. And so I think the new podcast will be more about that. But I'm not going to push myself. I'll let it evolve. So maybe six months to a year or so. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes you want a break. I've been podcasting for 14 years, and every week I've got to do some kind of a podcast, and we actually changed our methodology where we do them in a 2-week period. turn and burn, get them all done, and then I can breathe for a while, and they get released
Yes.
over time, and just changing up all those strategies to ensure that, you're fresh and you have ideas. And, I love this topic, about visible and valuable for women, because it still is a struggle. It still is a
Yeah.
struggle. And I think it's an internal struggle now, less than it was an external struggle. There's still both, but I think more of it lies with the individual than it does with the external, in most cases. But I love that you're heading in that direction. I love that, for that piece of it. So this obviously then also continues to support, speaking up and speaking out.
Yes. Yes. And it's visible and valued.
Oh,
So we
really?
know
Yeah.
we're valuable.
Mm-hmm.
But how can you be valued externally? How do you shift the way you're perceived by shifting the way you communicate? And that's what it's all about is, um, yes, recognizing your own value. That's part that comes
Mm-hmm.
with it, with the
Oh, yeah.
training,
Yeah. Yeah.
but also making sure other people recognize you and speaking out, speaking in public is one of the best ways. I mean, the cool thing about doing a presentation, whether it's within your organization or to the public or speaking on a panel, whatever it is, your listeners and your watchers perceive you in so many other forms. You get so much more from that than you get from a social media post.
Yeah.
And
Oh, no, for
so
sure.
so the written communication is very important and really good, but the live conversation is what connects people just on all sorts of subconscious levels
Yeah.
as well as conscious. And of course, if it's affecting your subconscious, you should be doing it well. It's worth taking the time to do a good one because it's easy. We've all seen the speakers where uh, just the way they talk makes me think, oh, I don't never want to hear from that person again.
Right.
And
Right.
that's another subconscious judgment.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and we do that, we tend to do that. That first impression is only what, 6, 8 seconds.
Yeah.
You only have 6 or 8 seconds to do it. And, that first impression really, really is hard to overcome if it comes out the wrong way, to begin with. Yeah. I love that this transformation is happening. This is why I do this follow-up show for all of the podcasts, so that people can see, wow, we don't have to just be stuck in whatever
Hmm.
it was that we decided to do as entrepreneurs and business owners, or a path that we had in the corporate world, that we can modify that path. And I think that that's so important. Do I stay the course? And I think that, this is how we evolve. And if we aren't involved
Hmm.
in the increasing the awareness of the need for change, so that we
Hmm.
can evolve, I think this is where we start, circling the drain in our own lives. Right?
Yes.
We start circling that drain and going, I really am not happy. I mean, so this is all about happiness too. It's all about being fulfilled, for the long haul. So what's ahead for you? So we know in the next year or so, you're going to have a new podcast. We know that you are going to be focusing on helping women in the corporate world, be visible and valued. What's
Hmm.
next? What else is in your back pocket you're not telling us about?
Well, I'm doing lots of speaking now,
Okay, great.
and I'm doing lots of podcast guesting. I've spent much of the past several weeks setting up new interviews. And one of the things I looked at is that there's sort of five reasons why people call me. One is they need to do a speech and they know it's worth investing in doing a really good speech. One is they're not being heard. As we said, they're not being heard in their organization. They want their voices to be heard. One is in our very international world, especially a business world, English is not their first language. And
Mhm.
I've been living and working internationally since I was 17.
Yeah, I
So I'm used
remember
to working
talking
in
about that.
other
Yeah.
languages and how to be heard. Plus, which with the opera companies, you learn diction. So
Right.
that's another thing that I do. And I'm doing speeches to international groups like the European Chamber of Commerce, the American European Chamber of
Hmm.
Commerce, doing speeches about that and learning how to show up as a leader, how to present yourself. There's one presentation that I'm doing for mixed groups about women don't think that men don't listen, and men think that women go on and on and on and never get to the point. And that's a very long title. It never fits on the flyer, but
I know. My husband calls it merge. It's
yeah.
funny when he's talking to my daughter and she's like, blah, 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 he just goes, merge, merge, right? Because he wants to have something to say.
Well, but one of the things, and this is something that I'm really passionate about, is that when one of the reasons why women, especially at a certain point in their lives, they get fed up with their job, and they often get fed up by not being heard.
Yeah.
And the thing that I talked about on your show was, I think that we've got men's language and women's language. And if you recognize that it's two different languages, then you will adjust. The problem comes when say a woman is speaking to in a male-dominated environment and she's not being heard, and she thinks that it's personal. She thinks that they hate her, and so she gets frustrated and quit. This happened to my client Maria, for instance, some years ago in Silicon Valley. She worked for a software company, and there was a project coming up, and she suggested herself for the project, but she didn't do it in a way that her boss, Jason, could hear. And so he didn't notice it. She just dropped a hint and he didn't notice. And she'd sweated blood over this proposal. And a week later, she said, "What happened to my proposal?" And he said, "What proposal?" And she was ready to quit, even though she loved the company, she loved the job. And one of her friends sent her to me. And I said, "Did you actually ask for the promotion?" There was a big project coming up. She wanted to run it.
No,
And
she expected it. Yeah.
And she realized she just dropped a hint.
Yeah.
And so we reframed the way she suggested it. And her boss said, "Wow, fabulous, wonderful." And she got the job, she got the promotion. And, but she was ready to walk away from a job she enjoyed because she didn't feel heard because of a misunderstanding. It's as if he spoke Spanish and she spoke Italian, and
yeah,
he
it's a
hadn't
whole
understood her.
Venus and Mars thing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you and I should talk offline about that because I have a story around that for myself that you can always reference if you need to. But I always called it when your company leaves you instead of you leaving your company,
Right.
because, and that's how I always said, is I didn't leave my company left me. They didn't recognize me. They didn't they didn't, I was pointing all these fingers at them and everything, a top producer in the company. And not once did they ask me to speak at a sales rally, or a sales meeting, but they had everybody else up. And I was the number one loan officer when I was in the mortgage. Number one loan officer, never asked me to speak. Never, never, never. And I would say, "Hey, I'd love to share this thing." And people would call me on the sides, "How'd you do that? And how are you doing this?" And I go, people are asking me, why not put me up at the sales meeting and have me share this to everybody instead of me taking phone calls all day long with everybody asking behind the scenes. But I think for me, I think they were afraid to admit that I knew how to do this. And if we put this out in the big thing, then everybody, we want to keep this all secret, that they're all asking questions behind the scenes. But I ended up quitting, and they lost a huge, opportunity. And I went someplace else and that recognized that and outperformed there too. So I took all my business with me. But
well, and they probably don't realize why you left. They probably thought,
well, actually they didn't until about, maybe 8 years ago. I was talking to somebody, he goes, I just sense that you're angry at me. And I am. Here's why. Oh, well, I didn't know. I didn't this, because they were good old boys. It was a good old boy company. And, but I encountered that in the mortgage and finance business for years and years and years. But yeah, so it's really cool that you're really stepping up and sharing this, with people.
One of the things that I talk about is, if you are not being heard, here's how to teach them to listen. Because that's a big part of the frustration that people come to me with, and they say, can you, Charlene said, when our first conversation, she said, can you get them to listen to me? They're making all these decisions and it affects my department and I could help. And they're throwing all this money away and I could have fixed it if they told me. So, so now they
Yeah.
do. Yeah.
I love it. I love it. Well, it's exciting what you're doing. It sounds like it's got a good runway headed, for the next 5-10 years. And, I know that's exciting for you as well, because we all are reinventing ourselves on a regular basis and coming up with new ways to talk about the same thing and new ways to talk about new things as well. So thank you so much, Elizabeth, for being with us. We have a link down below in the comments to her original podcast interview with us. And we will put her at Elizabeth information there so that you can reach out to her on social media and ask questions and have her come and speak to you and perhaps be part of her programs as well. So thank you so much, Elizabeth, for taking time to bring us back around to Beyond the Podcast.
Jen, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Of course. Of course. Okay. We'll catch you next time, everybody.